That men and women are different is probably for you no great revelation. And even normie types are aware of books such as Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, implying that men and women are quite different. But I think we often forget just how different men and women are and why they're so different, and why, at least the macroscopic scale, it's unlikely that men and women will ever arrive at a coherent understanding of each other, and more importantly, as a consequence of that, how it's unlikely that we'll ever reach any sort of consensus or sense of balance. At the microscopic scale, it might look a little bit different, but nonetheless, differences persist, and they often hinder us in understanding each other. So what do I basically mean? Men and women talk and walk past each other. Much of this, if not most of this, has to do with the simple fact that men and women evolve differently due to very different reproductive needs. Virtually all of it is down to that. Yes, of course, there's a ton of overlap, but the differences are quite profound. Random example I could just give off the top of my head is the fact that I play a lot of fantasy role-playing games, or I have historically at least, less so these days. And one thing I've noticed consistently is, inasmuch as women are interested in these types of games, especially in more recent years, the things that interest them are very distinct from the things that interest the men. What's a good example of this? Many of these women are obsessed with hair and makeup mods and romances with particular characters, usually some character that's very good-looking but goofy, or very good-looking but has sort of dark triad traits, this sort of thing. And so they're typically interested in romance and style mods. Very rarely do they comment on the actual content of the game, the overall story, the tale being told. And they're certainly, as a rule, not interested in the mechanics of the various RPGs they might play. So they typically play on lower difficulties. And it's mostly about the characters themselves, above all the romances they could participate in. Social stuff, basically. Men, on the other hand, obviously, when they're playing, myself included, we're more interested in the overarching story. I love a good story, a story that enthralls. And whilst I think it's important to have a good-looking character, and I lament the wokeification of a lot of character designs these days, after all, I can go out in public and look at a lot of unattractive obese people, I'm more interested in the mechanics as well as the story, and less so in the individual relationships between the characters, although they're somewhat interesting. Very simple example, but an example that drives home the point. But fantasy RPGs, or any sort of fantasy computer game setting, is rather tame compared to the bigger picture of reality. So when we talk about the macro scale, things look very grim indeed. And part of this is due to the fact that men and women fundamentally view each other differently, and their goals and desires as differently. Believe it or not, both men and women, mostly normies, but both men and women, will interpret the other sex through their own individual lens as either a man or a woman, respectively. So a classic example of this is the fact that a lot of women will complain about things like the glass ceiling and men out earning women and the usual stuff, right? Now, that's factually not true, but a lot of that comes down to the fact that women are very focused on the top males in any given society, even if they're not attracted to them. Those are the ones that are most noticeable. They will, for example, ignore the fact that most homeless, the vast majority of homeless in any given society, are typically male. People who sleep rough typically are male. Now, that doesn't change the actual stats, but women don't look at those men. And so they just see the guys at the top. They see the attractive, famous actors, the Brad Pitts, the George Clooney's, Bill Gates, or Jeff Bezos, or someone's in between like a Joe Rogan, even though most of his audience is male. Because those are the types of men they look out for, whether they're interested or not. Those are the ones that they actually pay attention to, that occurs to them. Not the unattractive guys, not the fat guys, not the fat and ugly guys, and certainly not the guys who are broke or not earning a lot. They will routinely walk past the street sweepers and the garbage collectors in their cities because they're invisible, basically. Never mind the people they're not seeing out there. Guys working on oil platforms, guys fishing for Alaskan king crab. Ever see some videos on how rough that work is? It's insane. I wouldn't recommend you to go fishing for Alaskan king crab off the coast of Alaska. Very dangerous work. Point is, women just don't see it any other way than the way they see it. Another point, women will get upset that men are judged by different criteria. And so, for example, lascivious, lecherous male is viewed as less damaging, less harmful than the female equivalent. And that's, again, just down to biology and the culture that we have evolved in that is infused with that biology. On the other hand, turning the coin on the other side, men notice that women can get tons and tons of sex. And they think that's a great thing. But for most women, just having sex per se probably isn't a good thing. For most women, they'll use it as a proxy at best for attention, their currency. But having lots of sex per se is not necessarily enjoyable and or desirable for them. But they do realize at times that that is an avenue they can use to get certain places in the world. And men look at that and think, wow, it's so easy to hook up, it's so easy to get laid. But in reality, most women don't want to just hook up and just get laid. It is the result of certain social pressures that exist, etc., etc. And so men are also looking at women from a different perspective. And then you have even more complicated matters, such as the fact that there are just, have to be honest, huge disparities in the amount of money spent publicly on women's welfare, their health, their well-being, etc., etc., even their success in terms of academia, scholarship, support, compared to men. And men look at that and rightly observe that that is just not fair at all, and the discrepancy is at times gigantic, especially for various illnesses that strike at similar rates and also claim lives at similar rates. The discrepancy is enormous. And so when you pick up on that, it's hard to really just accept things as they are. Of course, life isn't fair, right? Yeah, that's what it is. But observing these types of asymmetries in our society and observing the asymmetries even in your daily life, compounding that, really makes it difficult to just see eye to eye on any number of issues. Women vote differently on average from men. Men and women are just very, very different. And what brings us together is reproductive interests at the end of the day. There's a lot of mythology I've noticed over the years of people claiming that men and women have always worked closely together, but that's not actually true. Historically, men and women obviously reproduced, they had children, but their labor was very much divided. Men would mostly still spend time with men and women mostly with women. In fact, it's only been fairly recently that men and women have been spending copious amounts of time together, and guess where that's led? You can see all the problems that have arisen from this. Claims of sexual harassment, etc., etc. See statements made by people like Hillary Clinton, such as women are the greatest victims of war, when in reality, most of the men are dead, and despite that, they're described as the greatest victims of war. Things like that. It's hard to ignore these types of asymmetries. And yes, you can say that's the way it is, and of course, that's the way it's going to be. And we're not going to change that either collectively or as individuals. But that situation and the manifest differences that we have, that does not lend itself to a mutual voluntary understanding of each other. Now, this is perhaps where the micro scale might come in. Individual men and women might get along. They might understand the differences, what's driving them, etc., etc. But the problem is, all of us at the end of the day are microorganisms within the greater macroorganism of society. So there's going to be this constant tension and problem with both sexes looking past each other, talking past each other, walking past each other, because they view the other sex almost wholly from the lens of their own experience. And even beyond just that, as I pointed out, even if you didn't do that, it's hard to ignore the fact that women get a leg up in virtually every facet of life these days compared to men, and you're just supposed to suck it up and think that's okay. And if you even make note of that, you're called all sorts of vile names. No, the reality is fairly simple. We evolved in small communities and tribes. We were never really, in air quotes, meant to run these macroscopic, large-scale societies. But when you scale things up, all the tendencies that we have, to use the language of the great Baron of Brooklyn, the ooga booga comes out in us, and we just project our ooga booga onto the larger scale society, and this is what we get. And because of that, because men and women are so fundamentally different, and we view each other as fundamentally different, certainly in the macroscopic scale, it's bound to fail. And on top of that, I think it's important to point out as well, fully half of all relationships fail. Probably more, depending on how you look at failure. So men and women have a lot of issues with each other, and one thing that we definitely need to disabuse ourselves of is this notion that back in the days of yore, things were better. Back in those days, men and women got along. No, they did. Not particularly better. They spent less time with each other. There were other pressures there forcing them to cooperate. But this lesson really needs to be driven home. I don't really think there's a way of uniting the sexes as such because they're just so radically different from each other for perfectly good reproductive and evolved reasons. Anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in. Please hit the like button, share, subscribe, comment, all that YouTube jazz. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. Enjoy the rest of your week. Take care. May the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.